Lewis could hear the scratching of his brother's pencil. It grated on him, like nails on a blackboard. "Jacob, what are you doing?" said Lewis. His brother turned from his desk with a big dopey grin, looked over his spectacles and smiled with a mouthful of steel.
"What's the matter, brother?"
he said softly, with a voice that barely grasped the air. Lewis hated his brother's voice. It was nasally, and all he could see when he spoke was a cave of thick, sticky mucus. He looked at his brother, really taking in his grotesqueness, almost marvelling at it. It wasn't just his goof face and buck teeth that made him dislike him. It was his whole demeanour, his baby blue tank top, and that sickly yellow polo top underneath that he wore, looking like a gay golfer. When he stood close to him, he recoiled. It wasn't just his breath that smelled like fresh feces. It was his greasy forehead and dandruff in his awkward hair. It made him feel like he needed a shower when he was close. Jacob wasn't mentally disabled, but he was close. The kind of kid to get up and wave at a gunman if he entered the classroom. Lewis could live with his older brother's slow brain and poor hygiene, but he couldn't live with the idea of becoming him, becoming the school gimp, the embarrassed, the pathetic. Lewis was prepared to do anything to make sure his life path did not head that way.
"Why do you say cruel things, brother?"
asked Jacob, turning to face his brother on his bed. Lewis's eyes grew wide. This was incredibly brave of Jacob. Lewis looked at his brother's yellow spots on his forehead, waiting to burst. The thick glasses in the green mucus dried on his top lip. "What the hell are you writing about anyway?" said Lewis, changing the subject. He could have called him a cretin or a retard, but that would have been cruel, and he wasn't cruel.
"Mrs. Princeton told me to write about what makes me happy."
"Hell no," said Lewis, letting out a smile and jumping off his bed. "Is it a girl?" he said, trying to peer over his big brother's wide shoulders. Jacob arched his back and covered the paper with his arms, then slammed his head surprisingly hard against the table.
"Go away, Lewis,"
he said, shutting his eyes hard. Okay, he said, knowing his brother really meant it, knowing if he was to spook him too much he could freak out, and he didn't want to do that. Lewis decided to take a walk. It was raining, but he didn't mind. He had on his blue buffer jacket and his red headphones to take his mind off the weather. He walked several blocks, past the run-down shops and hobos sleeping on the streets, trying to keep warm. As Lewis turned the corner, he saw a group stood next to the old record shop at the bottom of the street. They seemed to be laughing as the hot steam rose upwards into the cold air. It was then he heard the screams. He took off his headphones, resting them on his neck so he could hear clearly. It was actually barking, snarling vicious sounds with laughter making it more disturbing. Lewis could see Rufio, one of the older boys from school. He stood in the centre with his arm around a small skinny blonde girl with his hand down the back of her skirt. Lewis couldn't help but stare as he walked closer. He could see the flashes of teeth through the crowd as the dogs fought ferociously. Suddenly he heard a high-pitched squeal and the crowd gasped. He watched Rufio throw down his smoke and step into the action. "Piece of shit," he said, grabbing the dog by the scruff of the neck, holding it high as its legs dangled helplessly. Lewis watched the blood pour down the dog's neck, mixing into its white fur on its belly turning pink. Rufio pushed through the crowd, nearly knocking over the girl he had been feeling up, walking to the bin beside the old record store and slung the dog into a metal tip. "Damn dog," said Rufio, turning back and scowling towards the crowd. Rufio then noticed Lewis. Lewis immediately looked down and picked up his pace, hoping Rufio hadn't seen him. "Oi!" said Rufio. Lewis's head remained down as he pretended not to hear. "Don't you ignore me!" Lewis could hear him, the tension in his voice, but he did not dare look. He listened to him cross the road, his steps hitting the wet tarmac fast behind him. Suddenly, Rufio's hand was hard on his neck, pushing Lewis forward, slamming his head against the shop window in front of them. Rufio's eyes grew wide and his nostrils flared. Lewis could feel his nails digging into his skin that was tearing open as his throat was closing shut. "Which bit didn't you understand?" said Rufio. Lewis struggled to breathe. He wanted to speak but couldn't as Rufio's grip tightened. In the corner of his eye, he could see the crowd watching, girls laughing and boys smiling. "Cut him, Rufio!" came a deep voice from one of the boys at the back. Suddenly, Lewis wasn't so concerned about the hand around his throat. He thought about a sharp knife potentially 6 inches deep in his stomach. As Rufio leaned in close to Lewis, he waited to feel life disappear. As his eyes flickered and rolled back, his skin was turning white as he suffocated. Rufio then let go, and Lewis's knees hit the concrete below as his body clung to life. He sucked on the air that felt sweet and thick. Rufio stood above him, and rested the sole of his high top on Lewis's temple, a sign of absolute dominance. "You don't ever ignore me again," said Rufio, looking into the sky, using the trickling rain to cool himself. He kneeled down, with his knee an inch away from Lewis's eyes, who looked at the dark denim intently, not daring to look Rufio in the eye. Rufio leant further down and rested his lips on Lewis's ear. "Go home, boy. If you ignore me again, I swear to God I'll cut you." Even though it was essentially a whisper, Rufio's words hissed hard on his eardrum. Rufio walked away, and Lewis watched him cross the road as the rain came down harder. He watched him strut to the group and grab his girl hard on the face, his hands like a vice pushing out her lips, then kissing her nastily. He then pushed her, and she tripped on the curb behind her. "Rufio! Rufio!" chanted the group of males as she banged her head on the closest building. Lewis got up slowly, with his hands stinging from cuts in his palm. He listened to the gang cackle as they walked down the street, and the heels of the girl who he had pushed over trying to catch up. Lewis wiped blood from his hands and put on his red headphones and headed home. By the time Lewis got back, it was dark. He went to his bathroom and washed his hands and entered his room as quietly as possible, not wanting to wake his brother. He tiptoed to his bed and got in and closed his eyes. All he could feel was his bruised neck and the sting of his palms as he tried to get comfortable.
"All okay, brother?"
came Jacob's voice softly through the darkness. Lewis ignored him, holding back the tears. The next morning, Lewis stood at the school gates. In front of him was a chorus of people entering Bridgeway Elementary. To his right was Rufio and his cronies. 4 of them sat on a car bonnet, smoking and laughing. Whether the car was theirs or not, he wasn't sure. He didn't dare look properly, but he heard one chuck up a huge amount of spit near the feet of kids who walked past. The car stereo played gangster rap, a heavy underground beat Lewis had never heard of. As Lewis looked at the stream of people flowing through the school doors, his heart told him to jump in and swim downstream. But where did that stream lead? Nowhere. Instead, he breathed deeply and turned towards Rufio and his crew. As he walked, he felt off balance and light-headed. The 4 hadn't noticed Lewis as he got close. Then Rufio looked his way. His eyes scowled with a look of confusion and state of permanent anger. "Do you have a death wish?" said one of the others, getting off the bonnet as he strutted up to Lewis. He was tall and gangly, and wore a black beanie hat. He walked right up to Lewis, halting him, leaned his body awkwardly down and looked into his eyes. "Do you?" he shouted, jolting his head forward, headbutting him a little. Lewis froze again and could hear Rufio laughing in the background, a deep laugh from the pit of his stomach. "Yo, Jester! Let me hear this, see what the guy's got to say." The so-called Jester stepped back slowly, his glare constantly on Lewis. Rufio sat on the car, head down, eyes up. As Lewis looked at him, he saw the king on his throne, the Jester and its delegates. Lewis stepped forward and bowed his head. His words came quietly. I've come to apologise for... Look at me when you speak to me," said Rufio, folding his arms. Lewis picked up his eyes from the concrete and looked at the man. I've come to apologise for yesterday." Rufio concentrated on Lewis's face. He licked his lips and run his thumb across his chin. Then his eyes widened, like a light bulb had just switched on. "Ah, the brother from yesterday. I knew you from somewhere." Rufio's face was brighter, softer. He got off the bonnet and walked up to Lewis, putting his hands around and grabbing Lewis's face, but this time not so hard. Lewis struggled to show he wasn't shaking. I knew you," said Rufio, lifting up Lewis's chin, inspecting his neck. "I got you, didn't I?" he said, laughing at his work, marvelling, enjoying the shades of blue and purple. He slapped Lewis's face lightly and left his palm there as he looked into his eyes. "Lucky I didn't slash you. Would have looked a lot nastier," said Rufio, laughing. Lewis tried to smile, but instead raised his lip awkwardly. Rufio looked over his shoulder and nodded approval, then back at Lewis. "You know what? That took bravery, and I respect that man. A man who apologises when he know he done wrong. What's your name?" Lewis." "Okay, Lewis. I haven't forgiven you. You pissed me off yesterday, but I'm willing to help you out. If you help me out." Lewis looked at Rufio in the eye and saw a chance. "What do you want me to do?" he said innocently as Rufio smiled. "Meet me here tonight, 9 o'clock. We'll pick you up. And wear black." Darkness had fallen outside the school gate at 8:55. Trees looked like claws that shook in fear with the wind. Lewis blew on his hands and looked down at the street, hoping the car would come soon to save him from the cold. He wore all black, like Rufio had asked, except for white laces in his high-top trainers. He checked his phone again, 8:58 p.m. As he put it back in his pocket, he heard the slow hum of a car working its way down the street. Lewis tried to peer in through the window as the car pulled up beside him, but it looked darker inside than it did out. The door opened, and the jester from earlier looked at him. "Get in." Lewis took his seat on the leather, and the car moved. Rufio smoked in the front as the smoke filled the car, making Lewis choke. The car picked up speed and rode through the night. 4 boys sat in each corner of the car in silence. As they rode around for a little, Lewis was sure they were going in circles, but he did not dare whisper his concern. An hour passed, and eventually they pulled up on the opposite side of the road to the town's college. The driver killed the engine, and the other 3 looked towards the reception, where there was a lone light that shone. "We're going," whispered the driver towards Rufio. He looked up and down the street and scanned the area for activity. It was quiet. He looked back towards the driver and nodded. They all looked towards the college reception and watched that light turn off. "It's time," said Rufio. He unclicked the glove box, and in front of him there was a hammer. He looked at Lewis in the seat behind. "You hold the door open for us, yeah?" Then they exited the car in unison. Lewis looked towards the reception and saw a young girl with a ponytail and college hoodie locking a glass door. He watched her pick up the folders she had put on the ground, and within a minute she was walking down the street. Rufio and his crew clung to the car, then crossed the road to catch up with the girl. As Lewis got out the car, he watched Rufio run, pulling up the hammer high. He lashed his long arm outwards, bringing the hammer down hard. She fell to her knees, and the lights from the lamppost above her shone on her as Rufio shouted something at her Lewis couldn't understand. He was fixated on the girl as her lifeless body hit the pavement. The other 2 went through her pockets as Rufio danced above her, roaring in the darkness. As they turned back towards the car, Lewis watched blood that looked like black pooling around her head. Rufio and the others ran back to the car, knocking Lewis as they jumped in, but all Lewis could do was stand and stare. "Yo, what is he doing?" shouted the jester, bringing Lewis back to reality. "Drag him in!" shouted Rufio. A hand grabbed Lewis by the hood and dragged him back into the car, reached over him and shut the door. Lewis's heart raced like the car. Rufio cackled like a wild animal in ecstasy. "You see that bitch? Ha! That will show her not to say no to Rufio." Lewis watched lights of the lamppost flash by as he looked out the car window. Rufio's laughter was menacing. All he could see was blood running from the girl's head. "Is she dead?" said Lewis, pulling himself towards Rufio's headrest. Lewis saw the driver and jester give him a look of evil. Rufio's head slowly turned, and that smile he had been wiped off his face. Rufio awkwardly moved, turning in his seat and pushing his foot against the glove compartment. He climbed over the gear stick and into the back and took Lewis by the throat. "Don't you get weak, boy," said Rufio quietly. He looked into Lewis's eyes and could see the panic and how young he was. Rufio thought he maybe had made a mistake. "What you gonna do? You gonna rat on Rufio?" he said, now pushing Lewis's head against the car window. "Yo, pass the knife," said Rufio, holding out his hand. The jester passed the knife to Rufio, who pushed the blade against Lewis's throat. "Tell me you aren't going to say a word." Lewis felt faint, like he was about to overdose on fear. His breaths were quick and sharp, his heart stung with every beat. Then all of a sudden, the words spilled. "No, Rufio, no, I swear, Rufio, please. It's just I've never seen that before, that's all." Rufio breathed deeply and pushed the blade a little harder before letting go. Lewis collapsed back into his seat, and Rufio put his head down to think. Rufio didn't say anything for a moment, and with every second that passed, Lewis knew more dangerous thoughts were growing in his mind. "Let me prove myself, Rufio. I'm not a rat. This is the real thing, I know." Rufio looked across at him with a vacant look that made Lewis tremble. He could see the blade still in his hand. "Anything, Rufio. You know I can do it." Rufio breathed outwards and bit his lip in thought. "You're gonna have to really prove it to me. I need to know you're not a squealer now. Anything, Rufio?" "Okay, I'll have something planned for you, and if you do it, you're in. But if you don't, you're dead, boy." Yeah, of course, whatever you need," said Lewis. The car stopped, and silence took over everything. Rufio leant back into his seat and stared at the windscreen. "Your house isn't far from here. Go. I'll meet you in the morning outside the school gates." "Blood, You tell anyone about tonight, I swear. Lewis said he agreed and got out the car slowly. He thought they would drive away, but they didn't. The car stayed there as he walked, and for a moment he expected to hear footsteps behind him and the swing of a hammer, but it didn't come. He walked home through the cold night air, beneath the clear sky and stars. Lewis had taken a pack of peas from the freezer. He had sneaked in, kept the lights off, and tiptoed, not wanting to wake anybody. He slowly opened the door to his bedroom and crept in. He lay on his bed and pressed the peas onto his eye and let out a sigh. It stung, but the cold was soon more noticeable than the pain. He was almost glad it was there. It took his mind slowly off the night's events. Suddenly, the light switched on. Lewis's vision blurred in the confusion. Stood at the end of his bed was a figure coming into focus, his big brother. He stood there with his dopey face, and for once it wasn't smiling.
You have peas.
Yeah, I do, brother. Can you turn the lights off? It's too bright.
Why do you have peas?
Brother, said Lewis, sitting up. Just please turn that light... What happened to you? Lewis noticed why his brother's usual dopey grin wasn't there. Jacob's eye was huge. They swelled, and they was almost closed entirely. It looked like a blue tumour grew under his skin. Jacob looked down slowly and took off his glasses from his pyjama pocket and held them up.
My glasses don't work anymore.
My God, Jacob, what happened? Lewis had never seen a black eye like it, but what was worse and looked more painful was the sorrowful look in his good eye. His face looked so sad, like an innocent child who had discovered the misery of pain. Jacob had always been called names since the kids were old enough to speak, but in his innocence, in his ignorance, he had always smiled as they laughed at him. He was just glad that people were happy around him. Someone had crossed the line. Lewis got off his bed. Lay down, brother, said Lewis softly. He watched Jacob limp towards his bed. Jacob held onto the side of the desk and slowly laid down. Lewis sat next to him and took off the frozen peas and laid them on his brother's face. Jacob winced, but he did not say anything. He trusted his brother. What happened, Jacob? Said Lewis, as Jacob put his hand over his brother's, where he held the peas. Lewis could see his brother's lip tight against his teeth, and he didn't want to speak.
They beat me. They beat me badly, brother,
said Jacob. Lewis watched his lips shake and a tear stream down his face. It was like it washed away the grotesqueness. Lewis had never seen someone so vulnerable. Who, brother? Asked Lewis. Jacob looked up, sniffing in his runny nose.
A boy in my class. His name's Sullivan.
Jacob cried a little more, and in the shame he turned his face away from his brother. Don't worry, brother. I can help you. I can help us both. I will make it so Sullivan never touches you again. I promise. Jacob whimpered, and Lewis got up. Brother, if you can't sleep, write in that book again about what you love the most. It might cheer you up, said Lewis, switching off the light and getting onto his bed, feeling a deeper love for his brother. Lewis stood outside the school gates below a clear sky. The school alarm had rung 5 minutes ago, and he looked across the road at Rufio by his car. Rufio looked at him from the corner of his eyes with arms folded and leant on his bonnet. Lewis crossed the road, clinging to his rucksack straps hard. Rufio, I'm sorry. Don't. The first time you did this, the first time you apologised, it was brave. Now it's pathetic, said Rufio, scowling at the ground, sounding more disappointed than anything. I took a chance on you, boy. You got weak. I still don't know what to do with you. What is it you want exactly? Said Rufio, looking at Lewis, taking out a cigarette and lighting it. I just want to be a part of this, the gang, said Lewis. Rufio laughed a little and blew a stream of smoke from his nose. You want to be in the gang? Why? Lewis looked at the ground and thought about his brother, about the sad look in his eyes from the night before. Protection, said Lewis. Protection, said Rufio, with a smile taking another drag. What do you want to protect? Said Rufio, sounding the most honest Lewis had ever heard him. My brother. Why? What's wrong with him? Some guy beat him up. Some guy called Sullivan. Lewis felt strange when he said this, thinking about the swollen eye. Okay, look. You can help yourself. I'll set something up so you can prove to me you got what it takes. And at the same time, you can help your brother out. How does that sound? Lewis watched the cigarette burn in Rufio's hand and felt himself doing the same. Perfect. Okay. You meet me here tonight at 8 p.m. Who's your brother? Asked Rufio, throwing down the cigarette and stamping on it. The school alarm rang, and kids left the school, hurrying home to their game consoles and TV. Jacob walked with his funny little walk, his arched back making him look like a chicken pecking. He carried his big backpack, his hands clinging to both straps that were both over his shoulders. His beige chinos were covered in cola stains that felt sticky. Some girl he didn't know pretended to spill it on him at dinner time. Because of his eyes, he was not able to wear his glasses, so he struggled to see. He was still far from home, but he had tripped twice already. Rufio's car made it up to him slowly, his window lowered as Jacob tried not to look.
Sorry,
said Jacob. Rufio didn't understand why he said that. He just laughed it off. Yo, wait up! Rufio killed the engine and got out his car. He walked up to Jacob, who he saw cower, ready to turn the other way, not daring to look at Rufio.
I said sorry,
stuttered Jacob. Rufio walked up and put his arm around him. Jacob winced, closing his eyes, bracing himself for the worst. Hey, come on now. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help, said Rufio with a big grin. Jacob slowly opened his eyes and could see a group of younger kids on the other side of the road staring, anticipating Jacob getting his head kicked in. It's Jacob, right? Jacob was surprised he knew his name, and strangely, it made him feel better. He looked at Rufio, with his arm around him, an inch from his face. Oh my, what happened here? Said Rufio, pointing at Jacob's eye. Jacob bowed his head in shame. Rufio put his finger beneath his chin and lifted his head, returning his gaze. Don't be ashamed, it's not your fault. Jacob smiled, and spoke so quietly, Rufio couldn't hear him. I couldn't hear you.
He hit me,
said Jacob. Rufio could see Jacob was close to tears. Who hit you, Jacob? Again, Jacob turned his head in shame, and Rufio again used his chin like a lever, pulling back his face to look at him in the eyes. Rufio didn't say anything, he just stared deeply into Jacob, waiting for him to crack.
Sullivan,
said Jacob, trying to look away. Jack Sullivan, in your class? Jacob gave one nod as he looked back into Rufio in the eyes. Rufio put his arms around Jacob and spoke closely. I know Sully well. Don't worry, Jacob. Me and your brother will take care of Sullivan. We'll make sure he never lays a hand on you again. Jacob broke free from Rufio's grip and wiped away his tears. Suddenly, there was a dumb steel grin.
You know Lewis?
Said Jacob, rising up on his tiptoes in excitement. Yeah, said Rufio, baffled. He looked at Jacob's face and sneered inside. He looked ugly the happier he got.
I love my brother,
blurted out Jacob. The words made Rufio feel awkward. He wasn't used to dealing with people that were happy. Well, yeah, and your brother loves you too. As Rufio spoke, Jacob squealed a little, looking towards the sky with pleasure.
I knew it,
said Jacob. That reminds me, said Rufio, taking a step back with his coy look. He looked at Jacob's vulnerability. It was like a child. He couldn't help but take advantage. Your brother is holding a surprise party for you tonight. Jacob began to dance up and down and turned around as he spoke to himself.
Oh, brother, only you are capable of such a clever plan, said Jacob.
He turned around to Rufio, who smiled. Rufio found the way he spoke peculiar, like Jacob thought he was in some Shakespearean play. Well, remember, it's a surprise, but I have to tell you the address.
It's fine,
said Jacob, stepping towards Rufio. His confidence had grown tenfold.
Where is it?
77 Park Avenue, said Rufio, trying hard to keep the smile off his face.
The street with the old gym on, right?
That's the one, said Rufio, heading back around to his car and putting in the key in the door.
Shall I bring a present too? To say thank you?
Whatever you want, mate, said Rufio, starting the engine. Just be there, 77 Park Avenue, and it's at 8:30, shouted Rufio out the car window as he drove off. Jacob's smile was stuck to his face.
I have just the thing,
said Jacob as he skipped home. Jacob wrote as quickly as he could, making quick changes to his essay in his bedroom. The house had been silent, except for the humming of the fridge from the kitchen. Then he heard the door with its usual slam. His brother was home. He took the paper and threw it into the top drawer of his desk, side. He heard his brother's loud footsteps come into the room, his black rucksack with nothing in it thrown into the corner, the springs in his bed creak as he jumped onto his bed. In a strange way, Jacob loved the sound of his brother coming home. It meant he wasn't alone.
Good day, brother,
asked Jacob, sat facing the wall, not wanting to show his big smile. I guess, said Lewis with a sigh. Jacob managed to contain his smile, trying to relax his face and drop his lips over the metal of his teeth. He got up and looked at his brother on his bed, and the smile returned immediately.
I love you, brother,
said Jacob. Lewis took his hands away from his face and looked at Jacob. He didn't say anything. He just nodded with a look of confusion, as if to say, "What's got into you?" But the longer Jacob stood there, the more his innocence shined. Lewis sat up and let out another sigh, this time a more emotional one. "Jacob, I'm really sorry if I've ever hurt you," said Lewis. Jacob lost the smile when Lewis said that. He didn't want to think of his brother in a bad light.
No, brother, don't say that. You're kind to me. I understand I'm not cool, that people laugh. I understand that you don't want to be anything like me, but understand that I love you.
When Jacob said this, Lewis felt like he could cry. He felt emotion rise from his belly to his eyelids where he felt it could spill. It was too much to look at his brother as he was about to say words he thought he never would. He looked away and spoke. "I love you, Jacob." A droplet fell from his eye and ran down his cheek. Lewis got up from his bed and laughed, hardly believing how he was feeling. Jacob laughed too, and the two brothers embraced each other. "You're the best brother in the world. You know that," said Lewis, holding his brother tight.
"No, you are brother,"
said Jacob. They held each other for about 10 seconds before letting go. Lewis went over to the drawers at the end of his bed and took out a fresh t-shirt.
"Are you getting ready?"
asked Jacob, putting his hand over his mouth, knowing that he shouldn't have said that. "Yeah. How come?" asked Lewis, confused, as he sprayed deodorant under his armpits. Jacob watched the canister spray spill from the gaps in his top.
"Oh, nothing. Just you're going out."
"Yeah, I'm going to be out a while. I don't know what time I'll be back, so leave the door unlocked, yeah?" Jacob laughed a little, impressed with his brother's acting.
"Sure, brother,"
he said, smiling as Lewis put on his coat. Lewis gave him a strange look, wondering what had got into him. "I get the feeling everything's going to be fine soon." "I promise," said Lewis.
"I know. I can't wait,"
said Jacob with a steely smile. Lewis smiled, thinking his brother was acting a little strange, then left the house, slamming the door as he always did, changing his thoughts to Rufio that waited for him.
"See you at the party,"
whispered Jacob. It was dark outside, and Lewis watched the lights of the dead-end town flash by as the car drove the streets. He watched dead-eyed people slumber, coming out of fast-food restaurants and hookers starting their shift. He despised the town, full of dreamers, wanderers that dreamt of achieving money and power. The only thing stopping them was the town. The path to nowhere, the only success to be found, was on the road out. If you stayed, you might actually find happiness and security, but only with the gang. And Lewis didn't have a car to drive far away, so he had one option. Rufio sat next to the driver. Lewis was behind him, next to the jester, the same setup when Rufio killed that girl. The car continued to circle the town in silence. The only thing stimulating the senses was the smell of weed fused into the car interior. Strangely, Lewis liked the silence. It was preferable to the speaking, as he might say something wrong and feel the wrath of Rufio. "You want to be someone, don't you, Lewis?" said Rufio calmly in the front. "I do," said Lewis, as his heart picked up the pace. Rufio turned the rear mirror so he could see Lewis. They looked at each other. Rufio's cold eyes spoke everything and nothing. "Tonight, I'm going to give you a chance to show me you got what it takes. I want you to show me what you're made of. I know you're young, but I think you're capable," said Rufio, opening the window, then sparking up a fag. He took a drag and blew the smoke outside. "You think we gain respect by being nice, or by showing people that we're not to be fucked with?" "Not to be messed with," said Lewis. "Right. And you think you get to be a part of this for free?" said Rufio. The car took a left out of the busy town into the street with houses. It was quiet, and Lewis could see a toddler's three-wheeled red bike lit up by the street light outside a house. "No, Rufio," said Lewis. The car came to a stop, and the driver turned off the engine. Rufio turned in his seat and looked Lewis in the eyes. "I've brought you here to show me you can do it," said Rufio, taking a knife from the glove box. The blade shone, 7 inches of misery, ready to fuck someone. Lewis took the knife and tried not to look at it. A different kind of emotion rose in his belly to his eyelids, coming close to spilling. He shut his eyes and shadowed the emotion, stopping the tears.
Right, it's okay, you don't have to look. But there's someone stood outside that house on the other side of the road. I need you to kill him,
said Rufio. Lewis felt his lip quiver. He tried to contain his nerves by grabbing the knife hard, squeezing it tight.
Who is he?
Whispered Lewis.
It doesn't matter who it is. Don't think about it,
said Rufio. Lewis' breath quickened and he loosened his grip on the knife. Rufio could see weakness and he knew exactly how to give Lewis the push he needed.
Do you want to help your brother? Or do you want to see him beaten and tormented for the rest of his miserable fucking life in this shithole town?
Said Rufio. Lewis opened his eyes and knew exactly what he had to do. He tried to blank everything out as he opened the car door. Lewis got out the car and kept his head low as he crossed the road, keeping his steps light, making no noise. He felt like a ghost. Physically and mentally, he was barely there. His mind was an empty vacuum. Everything was pushed out. He was drawn towards the porch of a house he hadn't yet laid eyes on, but he knew it was there. He could hear a silent cough from someone stood there. He tried to envision an object. He didn't want to make it real. He crossed the road, his eyes focused on the ground. He heard the cough and the turn of feet in front of him. He gritted his teeth and gripped the knife harder as it became real. 2 steps away, within striking distance, his steps changed, his feet hit the ground hard as he stood upright. With a deep breath, he lunged, sticking out his arm, pointing the blade at his victim. It pierced the victim's white shirt, then skin, and Lewis heard a gasp. His victim did not move. As he pulled out the knife, he watched the shirt turn red, and then a piece of paper dropped to the ground. Lewis stared at the ground, not daring to look at the man in the eye. And that's when he read the title on the paper, Little Brother. Lewis read the words as his hands trembled. He watched droplets of red blood drip onto the paper as he raised his head slowly. It was Jacob. He raised his hands upwards and touched Lewis's face.
Brother,
said Jacob. The little word was excruciating as he coughed up blood and fell to his knees. Jacob fell onto his back and Lewis held out his arms.
I didn't know,
said Lewis, putting his hands on his brother's cheek.
I.
Jacob's body started to convulse as blood eclipsed the porch. Lewis watched convulsions slowly take over Jacob, who let out a last breath.
I love you, Jacob. I love you so much,
said Lewis. Lewis hadn't heard the door of the house. He hadn't noticed Sullivan looking down at him. He didn't know that he had raised a knife high above his head, but he felt it pierce through him. He toppled to his side, shaking in the fetal position next to his brother's body as their blood mixed together. Rufio got out of his car and walked up to the house with a cigarette hanging out his mouth.
You're in,
he said, throwing the cigarette beside him. Sullivan smiled and stepped over the brothers' bodies and walked down the path, meeting Rufio, who put his arm around Sullivan. They turned and headed towards the car.
Now we're brothers,
said Rufio.